Let's return to This Week in America. Here's your host, Rick Bratton.
Welcome back, everybody. This Week in America, coast to coast. Thank you for being with us on the program. Happily Hippie, Meet a Modern Ethnicity, rethinks hippies. Hippidom didn't die. Rather, as with other outer groups, well, it became socially invisible. Happily Hippie by Paul Dougan argues that the counterculture is a 50-year ethnicity and explains hippiedom's ethnogenesis. Happily Hippie documents the counterculture's many accomplishments. If you're hippie, if you've ever been hippie, ever wanted to be a hippie, well, this book is a must-read. Paul is a Hippie-American teacher, writer, activist, and editorialist who lives in Boulder, Colorado. Paul Dougan, author of Happily Hippie, Meet a Modern Ethnicity, joins us on This Week in America. Paul, it is a pleasure. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Rick. I'm glad to be here.
I am looking forward to this conversation today. Where did this idea come from to write a book? And you've done it so well in laying it all out there. What was the inspiration for this book, Happily Hippie?
Well, two things I would say. One, I wanted to make the world and the nation a better place. And I thought that having hippie culture organized along ethnic lines, what we have for like now is for women and what the NAACP is for African Americans. I wanted to do this for Hippie-Americans. And it also stems from a personal incident. I was the victim of an anti-hippie hate crime when I was about 20 years old. I was walking down a street with a friend of mine. We both looked very hippie. And suddenly my glasses shot off my face like some kind of miracle. And something bounced off a nearby wall and out into the street. It was a golf ball. Someone had thrown a golf ball at me, and they'd hit my glasses right about there. And they've flown off my face. And
Wow.
Basically someone tried to maim, blind, or murder me because I looked hippie. And that became a kind of a seminal event in my life. And I think it's changed my life and helped one of the reasons why I wrote this book.
That's such a fascinating story, and we tend to think of hippiedom back, and you sort of forget the bad part of it as you were going through whatever time frame that was. I'm assuming 60s and 70s. You've got the good side and the bad side. Yeah, early 70s. The book Happily Hippie, A Modern Ethnicity by Paul Dougan, if you're Googling, that's Dougan. His website is happilyhippie.net. Talk about some of the main points in the book, because you really make a compelling case. And what are you seeking to begin a conversation, or to maybe convince some of us the points you're trying to make in the book? What are some of the main points?
First, hippie culture didn't end with the 1960s. It lives on, thrives even, and that's partly because we're seeing generational transfer. That is, based on their ethnic traits, hippie parents tend to have hippie children and grandchildren. Second, what I call Hippie-America is a modern ethnicity. We say modern because, again, it didn't die in 1970. That is, it has all the things that characterize an ethnicity, including the way society sees it, but it has unusual ethnic origins. Third, Hippie-America needs its own ethnic civil rights organization. Fourth, in contrast to the stereotypes of lazy Hippie-Americans spending their lives sitting listlessly on a couch, sucking on a bong, Hippie-America has made amazing contributions to the larger society. In particular, we invented the personal computer, and I document that in depth. Lastly, we need to take hippie culture seriously, to treat it with respect and not to trivialize it or dismiss it as a joke. That's prejudice and bad for the larger nation, as are all forms of prejudice.
And you do it, again, so well. The book is Happily Hippie, Meet a Modern Ethnicity by Paul Dougan, our guest on the program. The book is the website is happilyhippie.net. The subject has been covered before, but not done like this. This book really is unique, isn't it? What makes your book, Happily Hippie, stand out from all of the others?
Well, I believe it's the most important book ever written on the subject, and that's because the book uses something I call ethnic hippies theory, the idea that hippiedom is a living ethnicity again. This ethnic paradigm works astonishingly well, especially when we also explain hippiedom's novel ethnogenesis, that is, how it came into being, what I call synthetic ethnogenesis. That is, the culture doesn't arise directly from a specific geography, the way most cultures originated. Rather, unnatural, man-made factors like international mass media were involved in the context of creation of hippie culture. And the background of this is kind of a mass cultural malaise. People were dissatisfied with mainstream culture. And some sociologists referred to hippie culture as a revival movement. I think that's what it is. It tended to want to revive a culture that seemed to be in trouble.
Happily Hippie is the book. Paul Dougan is the author, our guest on the program. People may on the surface think, well, you know, this was something we associate with the 60s, in your case, early 70s, a decade long past. Why is it important today? And as you read the book, Happily Hippie, you make the case. Why is it relevant today?
Well, first of all, again, hippie culture did not die in 1970.
Yes.
Rather, it became socially invisible. And its presence in society has been and remains very important. For example, in one chapter of my book, chapter 3, I'm trying to prove that I believe prejudice against hippies, Hippie-Americans, has played a major role in American electoral campaigns, particularly presidential campaigns. And that came through very well. I found lots of evidence for that, right from the mid-1960s right through today. In particular, modern neoconservatism, that political movement that characterized by Ronald Reagan, the 3 Bush administrations and so forth, could not have become such a powerful national force without exploiting anti-hippie prejudice. For example, the Godfather of Neoconservativism, Irving Kristol, in his obituary, says that the 2 main pillars of neoconservatism, that word's hard to say, I'm sorry.
It's a mouthful.
Were anti-communism and hatred or dislike of the counterculture. So it's been a major force behind American neoconservatism, which has pushed the nation towards the right over the last several decades.
You know, this gives us a whole new perspective when you read Happily Hippie by our guest on the program, Paul Dougan, Dougan. His website is very simple. The website is happilyhippie.com, or .net rather, and all this on our website, thisweekinamerica.us. Tell me a little bit about why this book is so important and what message you were trying to leave with the people who read the book. They may go, well, that's long ago past, but there's so much great information in there, and you capture the movement so well that resonates to this day. What message do you want to leave with people who read Happily Hippie?
Well, I see hippie culture, what I call Hippie-America, as a living ethnicity. That is, as an ethnic minority. And many of the same lessons we could draw from other ethnic groups, such as African America or Mexican America or whatever, are applicable to hippie culture. In particular, it's been the subject of stereotyping, discrimination, a certain amount of hate crimes and hate mongering. And it is a huge ethnic group. I think it's about over 10% of the current U.S. population. That would be over 30 million Americans. And is transmitting, as mentioned, generationally. So we now have a hippie population that is of all ages, not just people who grew up in the 60s. I think that people, all readers, I think will find this refreshing because we tend to speak of hippie culture in a certain way that's dysfunctional, doesn't really make sense. We talk about it as existing only in the 1960s, but at the same time, we tend to admit it exists today. So there's a kind of duplicity there. And I think my perspective here helps in that duplicity. And particularly for Hippie-Americans, a lot of people, I think, are confused about who they are. You know, what is a hippie anyway, they ask themselves. And so this gives them a sense of ethnic pride. It helps them understand themselves and their culture and so forth. Incidentally, part of my approach is I don't believe there's such a thing as a hippie philosophy. I don't believe there's any cookie cutter ideology that all hippies subscribe to. I think rather there are hippie values. And those hippie values are what hold hippie culture together, not any particular ideology.
You know, it's interesting. You mentioned hippie to many people, and they think of the war on drugs. They think of behind legalization of the marijuana movement. Talk about that, because you address that in Happily Hippie.
Yes, I do. I spent a whole chapter on it, and I think it's pardon me, but probably the best anti-war on drugs piece ever written. That's because it starts off with this ethnic perspective. Um, and what I'm trying to prove there, first of all, is that the good things the war on drugs is supposed to do, it simply doesn't do. That is, it's supposed to reduce consumption of perhaps dangerous drugs and protect the public health. But as far as I can tell, there's no evidence whatever that illegalizing a substance decreases use or abuse of that substance. We might think that would be obvious, that if you punish something, you'll decrease that particular activity. But in fact, it's not true, and there's lots of evidence contradicting that. Now, the back half here is, what does the war on drugs actually do successfully? And that is, it persecutes ethnic minorities. That includes racial minorities also. The first anti-drug laws in America were used to persecute Chinese Americans, Chinese immigrants in particular, and they were anti-opium laws. The first anti-marijuana laws were targeting Mexican Americans. Cocaine laws and also marijuana laws have targeted African Americans. There's long been the accusation that, the racist accusation that cocaine use made African Americans rape white women, things like that. And what happens here is we have this racism being the basic mainstay behind drugs being illegalized. And then in the 1960s, mid-60s, hippie culture comes into being, and the war on drugs simply translates right into hippie culture. And you might recall that Richard Nixon actually appointed the Schaefer Commission to study marijuana legalization. The Schaefer Commission actually recommended legalization, to everyone's surprise, and President Nixon ignored them and began the first official so-called war on drugs. I believe the war on drugs is there to target Hippie-America in particular. And the reason I think that is when you look at their rhetoric, the rhetoric of the people behind the war on drugs, people like William Bennett and so forth, you find what they're talking about really is reining in hippie culture, and I think destroying hippie culture, which is a sort of ethnic cleansing.
And you make this case, yes, go ahead, finish your thought, but you make that case so well in your book.
I think that the legalization movement, which is very successful, just had 2 more states legalized, I believe New Jersey and Arizona. I believe the legalization movement is actually a kind of a form of Hippie-American social equality, or fighting for Hippie-American rights.
We talked before about an organization that would represent the hippie movement, and this group of you feel 30 million people out there, and it makes sense the way you break that down. What would that organization look like? How would it start, and what would the function be?
Well, let me make an analogy first of all. Let me say before that is, it's not a political party. It would be an ethnic organization. And as such, think of what the NAACP is to African Americans, what certain organizations like the GI Forum are to Mexican Americans, what the National Organization of Women is to female Americans. This organization would be to Hippie-America what those organizations are to those groups. So the first task of that group would be to, first of all, point out that Hippie-America still exists. We did not die in 1970. And to make Hippie-America respectable. There's other things we would do too. There's lots of things an ethnic organization can do, but those would be the main tasks. I'd like to start this organization. I have a list of prominent Hippie-Americans. That is, people who are kind of household names, who my research shows to be Hippie-American. And I would like to get these people to endorse the group, because I think that people are more likely to pay attention to a celebrity, rightly or wrongly, than they would just a person they don't know.
Yes.
So, for example, there's a bunch of Hippie-Americans in Hollywood who I'd like to ask. People like Jennifer Aniston, or Johnny Depp, or Julia Roberts, or Woody Harrelson, or Whoopi Goldberg, or Leonardo DiCaprio, or Shailene Woodley, among many others. So the idea is to get these people to endorse a democratic rights group, a group where, again, because we don't have a common philosophy, you're going to see conservatives and liberals in a variety of viewpoints, but people who want to see hippie culture protected and for Hippie-Americans to have full social equality.
With us on the program is Paul Dougan. Boy, the time is going by so quickly. If you're Googling, Dougan is Dougan. The book is Happily Hippie. His website is happilyhippie.net. Book available at other places and easy to get at and get all the information by going to Paul's website. You really did a nice job. Are there any particular chapters that stand out to you that you feel like, okay, this really is persuasive? And what did you enjoy most about writing Happily Hippie?
Well, I think the parts I enjoyed the most writing and actually researching was when I had a hypothesis of something in particular. And then I would go out and do my research, and my research would substantiate my hypothesis in spades. For example, I mentioned Chapter 3. I wanted to prove that anti-hippie prejudice has been a major factor in U.S. elections. And I was able to prove that from Ronald Reagan's 1965 or mid-1960s gubernatorial campaign in California, right up through the 2016 election. Another case, I was looking for evidence that hippie culture is been highly successful in society, and could I prove that? I think many people tend to trivialize hippie culture and think that, well, maybe they invented nothing more than the lava lamp. In fact, I found a great deal of evidence showing that hippie culture invented the personal computer. There's several books about this and scholarly articles, as well as many other things. As I mentioned, there are lots of hippies in Hollywood, comedians, actors, directors. Hippies have invented many particular inventions or industries. The adventure gear industry, that is, if you're going out to do some serious camping, you buy a tent and a few other things. The modern adventure gear industry is hippie dominated and created, and American microbreweries. The modern American microbrewery industry is hippie dominated. There is famous hippies in sports and in philanthropy and so forth. So I ended up being able to prove hippie contributions to society very well. Another chapter, I wanted to prove that hippies are stereotyped much the same way that other ethnic minorities have been stereotyped in America. And I should mention also racial minorities. And that also came out surprisingly well. For example, we tend to think that traditional minorities, or at least the stereotype, is that they're subhuman and primitive. I was able to prove that with Hippie-Americans, that they have been stereotyped in that manner, and many other stereotypes too. Lazy, drug addicted, promiscuous, anti-American, enemies of God, and so forth. And there were other areas in the book that also worked out. I think the part that I enjoyed writing the most was the part where I got to be kind of step out of argument for a while and write satire. So in Chapter 11, I have some fun satirical pieces doing media analysis, looking for hippie stereotypes in the media. And I enjoyed that part the most because it made me laugh, and I hope it makes my readers laugh.
The book is so well done. Happily Hippie. The author is Paul Dougan, our guest on the program. A couple minutes left in the program. The book sometimes seems somewhat academic as you're approaching the ethnicity part of this. Talk about your qualifications to do this, because you present it in such a logical, rational way.
Thank you, Rick. Actually, I have a master's degree in English education. I'm an English teacher by trade, and I'm well-read, but I don't have a PhD in ethnic studies. But I have consulted scholarly sources where needed. So yes, there is a adequate scholarly background for this book. Generally, I produced a book that I call, quote, popular social science, unquote. That is, it's scholarly and scientific where needed, yet it remains relaxed, accessible, and fun to read.
Well, it is that, and it's eye-opening when you go through the personal computer. You go through all the phases of our society that have been influenced by the hippie generation. Is it safe to even call it the hippie generation? That makes it sort of like I'm putting it in a box and it's past now, because it really isn't. It's something that lives today, doesn't it?
Thank you for pointing that out, Rick. That is, in fact, one of the major points of my book. That generational hippie generation paradigm is, I think, a flawed paradigm. If you look at around you, just go out in the world today and look at people and on the street and so forth, and you'll see a certain percentage that look identifiably hippie. Now, if you look at those people and ask what their ages are, you're going to quickly come to the conclusion that most of them were born long after the 1960s ended. In other words, there are hippies of all ages, and while the first generation of hippies came of age in the 1960s, the hippies have been coming of age ever since that, including today. I think there are hippies who are from toddlers running up to senior citizens. So yeah, I try to avoid that hippie generation label, Rick.
It's almost like the two words, and I said that without even really thinking it. As soon as I heard that, it's like, no, that's not quite what I want to say, but it's almost like they attach the word together. If you say hippie, you've got to put generation after that, which is said, puts it in a box and puts it on the shelf with history books, and that's not the case. A minute or so left in the program. Kirkus Reviews said persuasive. They really liked the book, but said maybe this shouldn't be considered an ethnicity. Talk about that aspect of it.
Well, I think it's true that Hippie-America is largely white, but that accusation strikes me as shallow political correctness. It simplistically assumes only people of color can be oppressed. That simply isn't true, and an injury to one is an injury to all. In other words, what is bad for hippie culture is bad for people of color and everyone else. As for the cultural exploitation charge, there's no evidence for it. When, for example, a countercultural guitarist like Eric Clapton plays the black bass electric blues, how is that exploiting or denigrating African-American culture? I just don't see it. I think it's a false accusation.
Well, they are right about persuasive. You do an excellent job in presenting the case. The book is Happily Hippie, Meet a Modern Ethnicity by Paul Dougan, Dougan. His website is happilyhippie.net. Excellent website. You'll get a lot of great information there. You can order the book there as well. Book available wherever books are sold, and Paul's website will be on our website, thisweekinamerica.us. Paul, I've enjoyed having you on the program. You've done an excellent job of presenting your case. It's done very well. Thank you for sharing it with us on the program.
Rick, it was a pleasure to be interviewed by you.
It's an eye-opening book, Happily Hippie. You'll enjoy reading it, and we'll learn a lot in the process. Again, the information available on our website, thisweekinamerica.us. The author is Paul Dougan. We're back on today's program right after these messages.
This Week in America is online. You can visit our website, thisweekinamerica.us. Scott Pinkerton, Associate Producer of This Week in America. Jay Anderson, Segment Producer. Ben Watson, Webmaster. Otto Bechet, Director of Engineering and TV Production. This Week in America produced and is a trademark of Blue Funk Broadcasting, LLC. For information on all of our guests and to listen to this week's show, our website again at thisweekinamerica.us. And I'm Sean Bratton, Executive Producer of This Week in America.